Well, I like to think we've explored some abiding themes in this class. And one of these themes, those of you who are in the field trip know that we talked about this in the art museum, is that every generation views the previous generation's art with a highly critical eye, those old farts, and a determination to produce something new and one hopes better. So, the classical Greek sculptors thought the archaic sculptors were too stiff, and just check out those goofy smiles. The Hellenistic Greek sculptors thought that the classical sculptors were cold fish, those cold emotionless purists, while the classical Roman sculptors thought the Hellenistic Greeks lacked dignity and self-control. The Renaissance artists called their predecessors Gothic or barbarian, but let's face it, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, these guys were tough acts to follow, especially on their home turf. So we're traveling back to Italy now for this next lecture, and we're going to look at the art of the Italian High Renaissance's immediate heirs in Italy, a period that art historians have somewhat confusingly labeled Mannerism. I think the best way to start looking at this art is to consider the work of an artist who outlived most of his own generation and really traveled the road from High Renaissance to Mannerism in his own painting. So, who am I talking about? Any guesses? Actually, if you have the slides in front of you, it's probably easy. Michelangelo. Now, I've already regretted assigning Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Renaissance unit. Next year, I'll stick it here, even though your textbook doesn't put it in Mannerism. Most art historians do. So on this slide, we see two fresco paintings by Michelangelo, both painted for the Sistine Chapel, but 30 years apart. Now, of course, the subject matter is different, and the Last Judgment is inherently a grimmer theme. Still, what changes do you observe over 30 years? Well, in the first painting, God the Father is powerful, but I would argue he's not really forbidding. Christ in the Last Judgment is a rather scary figure. Even by Michelangelo standards, Christ's body is almost grotesquely muscled, powerful to the point of seeming dangerous and threatening, especially since he's gazing down not at the saved who are coming to join him, but at the damned who are being rowed away. Even his mother Mary, pictured just behind him, almost seems to be cowering in Christ's presence. And notice that's very unlike Eve in the earlier painting. She looks a little shy but eager as she rests under what looks like a sheltering arm. What do you notice about the colors? Well, the colors in the Last Judgment are less vibrant. There are more gray and blue tones predominating. They're also, I think, a little unsettling, even jarring. And think about why that might be true, and I'll return to that point, although this would be a good time to offer suggestions. So here's a detail from the painting, St. Bartholomew, who was martyred by having his skin flayed off. And here he is holding his own skin. What's really creepy is that Michelangelo has given the skinned saint his face, his broken nose and all. So what's going on here? Why are we seeing such a dramatic change in outlook in 30 years? I'm going to return now to the video on the history of the Medici family that we watched earlier. I'm going to pick up in the third volume or the third hour as Lorenzo the Magnificent's second son, Giovanni, is now the leader of the Catholic Church in Rome. He is Pope Leo X. His successor, Clement VII, was Lorenzo's nephew, and they were very closely allied. So basically, the Medici controlled the papacy during the critical years when Luther first offered his challenge to the church. And in fact, one of the major reasons why the sale of indulgences increases as much as it did is that Leo X, frankly, had champagne tastes. He threw huge parties, he loved wine, women, and song, and he needed to raise money not only for his artistic and building projects, but also to support his lifestyle. As you might expect, that teed a certain number of people off. So here's a very brief explanation of the incredibly complex international politics of Europe at this time. My apologies to Ms. Jacobs, who knows this stuff and is probably horrified at this Cliff Notes version of history. But basically, you have two Catholic monarchs, Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, duking it out for who's going to be the top dog on the continent. Italy mostly just gets ground up in the process. Even though the French king persecuted the Protestants at home, he allied with German Protestant princes, as later French kings would do, because they were a counterweight against the Holy Roman Emperor. And it was these German soldiers who were invading Rome in 1527 because the Pope had sided with the French, because he too was worried about how powerful Charles V and the Holy Roman Empire was becoming. At any rate, you don't actually have to know all of that in detail, but you should have a general sense of the unrest, the religious war, the turmoil in the church, the turmoil on the continent, the changing political climate with the rise of major kingdoms. All of that has something to do with why Michelangelo may have been filled with despair and why Florence would abandon its republic for a monarchy ruled by, you guessed it, still another Medici. And by the way, the painting of the Massacre of the Innocents that appears in this video was painted by a student of Michelangelo who was later nicknamed Large Underpants. Stay tuned and you'll find out why. So it's really hard to see this huge and complex painting on a single slide. I wanted, however, to give you a quick look at the entire composition, and then I want you to think about how it compares with this famous composition, The School of Athens by Raphael, perhaps the epitome of high Renaissance composition and painting. So, what strikes you about the comparison? Well, the Last Judgment is, both paintings, I should say, have a lot of figures in them, but this is much busier. The composition is more confusing. There's more activity. The figures are twisted. They're moving. They're dramatic. Here again, I think the colors, although often bright, seem a little off. So the effect of the School of Athens is more soothing, more rational. Michelangelo's painting is intended to unsettle the viewer, presumably to turn our thoughts towards sin and its consequences. But note it is a much, much less confident and self-congratulatory painting, and as such, it reflects the spirit of its age. Now, one reason I've already mentioned that we find this painting unsettling is its colors. This is something your textbook doesn't talk about much, but I listened to a couple of lectures on Mannerism, and those lectures at least thought that the colors were quite important. So we haven't really talked about color in very much detail since our first unit. Sorry about the slightly blurry slide. But take a look at this color wheel and pay particular attention to the tertiary colors. Those are the colors that you get when you blend a primary and an adjacent primary and secondary color. Notice that they are less brilliant, more muted. They're colors that our eye actually is not as accustomed to, and they tend to jar our senses, to startle us. It's a little harder to pick out, but Michelangelo has moved toward a greater use of tertiary colors in this composition, and that is characteristic of Mannerist paintings. And again, we find these colors somewhat jarring, and that effect is entirely deliberate. So here's again, slightly blurry detail from The Last Judgment. This is a detail from The Damned. So again, you see these writhing, distorted figures, a sense of movement, of high drama and emotion. So we're moving into the Mannerist period and even into the Baroque. I think it's quite hard to distinguish Baroque and Mannerist painting, and I'm actually hoping the College Board really doesn't put you in a position where you have to. I'm guessing that questions about Mannerism will be relatively easy to distinguish from Baroque. But I would just note now, and we'll be talking about this in the next few lectures, that in the Baroque era, the church is basically regaining its confidence, refining its footing through the Council of Trent. It's actually reconquering areas that were held by the Protestants. So the paintings of that era are dramatic for reasons I'm going to talk about, but they aren't as unsettled. So stay tuned. Well, we know from Michelangelo's, but let me back up and say I've been talking about sort of the world situation, but there's a personal side to this as well. We actually know a lot about what Michelangelo was thinking because he wrote very vivid, actually excellent poems. And we know from his poems at this point that he was troubled by turmoil in the church, but also by doubts about his own salvation, maybe fears. He was an old man at this point about his approaching death. He was also fighting with his latest papal patron. You may recall that he fought with his previous patron when he was doing the sealing. Michelangelo was, by all accounts, not an easy guy to get along with. Interestingly enough, the reason he was getting into fights with Pope Paul III is that the church was finally taking Luther's call for reform seriously. The new Pope Paul III, who was not a Medici, set out to end many of the abuses that had helped spark the Protestant Reformation. This is an effort that's going to culminate in the Council on Trent, which I'll talk about a little later, not in this lecture, but in one of the next two. Although I would note that like the Medici popes, Paul III worked hard on behalf of his relatives, including his many illegitimate children. But one of Pope Paul III's reform efforts brought him into conflict with the now elderly Michelangelo. I thought you'd enjoy that story, which is in the next video clip. But the video clip will also bring you up to date on what's happening in Florence, because Mannerism, like the early Renaissance, is actually more than anything a Florentine phenomenon. So after the two Medici popes died, the family, it seemed like they were going to fall from power, and they had been kicked out of Florence periodically and came back. I mean, keeping track of what's up with the Medicis is probably more than you want to bother to do, at least until you get through the AP exam. At any rate, the heir this time was a remote country cousin, also named Cosimo, and it turned out Medici's got lucky that even though he'd grown up in the country and not in the milieu of humanist Florence, he was in fact a strong military leader and a determined autocrat. So, and this is cutting a lot of history short, he overthrew the Republic, got himself named Duke, or Cosimo I, married a princess, conquered much of northern Italy, and set out to create a court that rivaled those of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, these dual developments, the Catholic Church's pushback against the Reformation and the rise of a Florentine court that had courtly aspirations, if you will, formed the backdrop for Mannerism. Okay, no more videos today. So before we move into courtly mannerism, I want to take a quick look at the painting that you kept seeing in the first video. This is the painting by the Underpants guy. Since you don't need to remember him or his work, and surely you will always remember him as the Underpants guy, I haven't bothered with the label, but can you guess what scene from the Bible is being portrayed here? All those dead baby boys should be a good hint. It's the Massacre of the Innocent, when Herod murdered all baby boys under the age of 2 in an unsuccessful effort to take out Jesus. So what Renaissance elements do you see in this painting, and what elements seem to move beyond the Renaissance to a new era? By the way, it's good practice to identify traits in paintings that you haven't seen. You may have noticed that the College Board will sometimes ask you to do this, and they'll deliberately seek out a painting that doesn't show up in any of the major art history texts. Well, you see the architectural elements, right? Also, the human bodies are carefully modeled, and they seem to have more weight and substance than they do in some Mannerist paintings. So that's showing this debt to classical sculpture. But it seems to me that this painting and The Last Judgment are related to each other in much the same way, this painting and the Sistine Chapel Michelangelo paintings are related to each other much the same way as classical and Hellenistic sculpture. So we see more active bodies, more twisted torsos, and the content or theme of the painting is more dramatic and emotional. Again, we're about to go for the Baroque. And by the way, this oscillation back and forth between more rational, less emotional painting and highly emotional painting or sculpture, something we're going to see several times again in art history. For example, moving from the neoclassical painting to the Romantic, and moving from the Impressionist to the Expressionist. So think about this again as another of our abiding themes. But meanwhile, let's explore another side of Mannerism, the side that gets more attention in your textbook. I've spent a lot of time on context. Partly that's for the whole unit. I'm going to spend less time on the more courtly Mannerist painters. That's partly, by the way, because they are discussed so well in the Khan Academy podcast that we assigned. And let me make a point here about how Ms. Jacobs and I try to structure this class. We don't want you to use your class time. We don't want to use our class time simply repeating what you should already have read or watched. And we don't want to give you an excuse for neither reading nor watching. So don't just skip the homework and rely on what happens in class, okay? We are actually trying to offer you different experiences, if you will. So assuming you did not skip the homework and you know something about mannerism, what Mannerist elements do you see in this painting? Well, you don't have this slide in your notes, by the way, because we want you to take notes. So the Renaissance strove for a kind of realism, getting the bodies right, getting the proportions right, announcing their interest in human beings and life here on earth by getting away from what they perceived as Gothic distortions. Well, distortions reappear in Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and they reappear in these courtly paintings as well. So look at the hands and feet. They're often out of proportion, and they look strange, almost boneless. Mannerists were actually obsessed with hands and feet. Beautiful, useless hands in particular were a sign of aristocratic status. The faces, similarly, are often seen hiding their emotions from the world, and this was part of the expectation of life at court. Also, Mannerist artists were obsessed with masks. I hope you noted in the podcast on the portrait of the young man how masks actually deliberately appear in the painting. Again, this is reflecting an aristocratic culture where people were deliberately masking their emotions and intentions. The painting also has this kind of chilled, almost emotionless quality. Again, this is typical of courtly mannerism. We see it somewhat in the International Gothic. What do you notice about the baby? Looks almost like a dead baby. Do they still tell dead baby jokes? That was one of the real low points in my childhood. And his pose across his mother's lap is almost certainly a deliberate evocation of what work? Michelangelo's Pietà. The Mannerists, and also, does this remind you of any earlier period? The Mannerists admired Byzantine and even more the Italian Byzantine painters such as, do you remember her name? Cimabue. So look at that face and the long nose. And there's some hints there. Finally, what's with that topless column and the pointing figure on the bottom, which at least one of the historians I listened to thinks was probably a prophet? Well, maybe the artist is suggesting that despite the seeming tranquility of this painting, the world outside is in turmoil. And in fact, Italy has a lot of troubles ahead of it. Okay, here we see two depositions, or maybe depositions, Descents from the Cross. The one on the left by Pontormo is a well-known Mannerist work. Van der Weyden's is a famous work of the Northern Renaissance. So what differences do you see? Well, for one thing, we don't actually know if Pontormo's painting is an entombment or deposition because there is no cross, there's no tomb, there's no ladder. We don't get any other useful clues about what's going on. Van der Weyden has tried to create some sense of a real space, although actually it's not a perfect example because his is a kind of flat and unrealistic space. Some of the other Northern Renaissance painters and the Renaissance painters are much more careful about creating a realistic space. But in the Mannerist work, the descent really seems to take place in a kind of artificial space. Again, you have this sense of being on a stage. So what other Mannerist elements do you see in Pontormo's painting? Well, the bodies seem really almost weightless. Are these real bodies? Who's supporting Christ? Is he heavy? The positions of the legs, too, seem very unnatural. This is not contrapposto where you're really, looking like the person is shifting their weight realistically. These are almost impossible postures. And while this is more emotional than the Madonna with the long neck that we just saw, the emotion seems kind of posed or theatric. And again, I think we're back to those masks. And finally, we see those somewhat startling colors. Their paleness startles us. Usually these are done in much more vivid colors. Also the orange rather than the red. Again, with this Mannerist painting, we see this almost porcelain mask portrayal of skin. Again, this is part of the aristocratic culture. Aristocrats didn't have to work out in the sun, so their skin stayed pale. This painting also has some really kind of disturbingly incestuous, erotic themes. Again, this is a court where sexual morality was not exactly at its Christian height. By the way, if you're wondering why I say incest, Cupid is Venus's son. It may have also, however, been an allegory intended to show that love is folly, that bad things are awaiting, look up above. The deliberate ambiguity is actually another feature of mannerism. Remember, mannerism is kind of meant to keep us and take us off balance. I don't think this was in your textbook. I hunted. Maybe I missed it because it's probably the most famous of Bronzino's work. It's a portrait of Cosimo I's princess bride, Eleonora de Toledo. So you see some of these same features, the porcelain face, that emotionless aristocratic calm, the extremely elegant dress. By the way, the painting of the textures with oils is something that's borrowing really from the Northern Renaissance. And finally, again, you see those boneless, elongated hands. And we see similar Mannerist elements in this Bronzino painting. Again, I'm not going to talk about this a lot. I thought the Khan Academy podcast on this was particularly good. I could really imagine this being a painting that the College Board chose to focus on. I hope you bother to listen to the podcast if you haven't already. Same thing for Tintoretto's Last Supper. I really don't have a lot to add to what I hope you've already listened to. So I'll just ask a question and leave it open to discussion. I hope you did listen to the podcast. Why do we find this Last Supper so startling? Well, one answer is that the diagonal composition jolts our expectations. Those other Last Suppers we've seen, I would have stuck some in here, but this is already getting very long. Usually we have a horizontal table. We aren't expecting to have this diagonal. And then there are these twisted figures, those odd ghostly angels, the double light sources with the strong contrast between dark and light. And then you have these odd, again, somewhat jarring, somewhat intriguing domestic details, such as the dog and the cat. At the risk of repeating myself, watch the podcast. Tintoretto is sometimes classed as a Mannerist, sometimes as a Baroque painter. By the way, you do need to know he's a Venetian painter, which is a question they might well ask. I don't think the College Board would make you choose between Mannerist and Baroque on something like this, but you should note that the twisting figures, spiraling is the term that's sometimes used, the highly dramatic, almost stage-like setting, the sharp contrast between light and dark, these are all quite Baroque features. But the strange colors, the jarring diagonal composition, these are more Mannerist. This is a guy who I would say is probably determined not to be Leonardo. Out with the old generation, in with the new. Oh, I should have had that up earlier. Those shows you shows you that the vanishing point is not where you expect it. So Veronese, who's another Venetian painter, and actually it's important to be able to identify the painters of Venice. Remember, we have Titian, we have Bellini, we have Veronese, we have Tintoretto. So Veronese, by contrast, seems closer to the, and Giorgione, I should have said. So Veronese seems closer to the Renaissance, especially with those architectural features. It's interesting, though, that this painting was originally entitled The Last Supper, and the church objected. There were just way too many secular details, all these figures from court. What were they doing in a Last Supper? Veronese, who understandably did not want to change his painting, decided to change its name instead, and so you have Christ in the house of the tax collector. Note, by the way, who's also Matthew. Note the sumptuous depiction of the Venetian court. In this regard, Mannerism and much Catholic Baroque art actually has features in common with International Gothic. So I'm going to close, I'm going to save Mannerist sculpture and architecture for my first lecture on Baroque art. Actually, the distinction between Mannerist and Baroque architecture and art is a lot less finely drawn, and some art historians don't even think it should be made. But at any rate, sticking with Mannerist painting, here's another of those summary slides that I borrowed and adapted. Now, I have left out one Mannerist painter, by far my favorite and really by far the most famous of the Mannerist painters, and that is El Greco, a Greek painter who worked largely in Spain. I'm going to begin my next lecture on his weird, wonderful, and I think spiritually very evocative world. And then we really will enter the Baroque.